Can red and yellow look pretty in pink? Recently I was watching a Twitch stream and I ended up propagating the rumor that red and yellow go better over a pink base coat. I don't like to leave things untested, so I prepared myself 2 pink ladies to test this theory out for myself. The ladies are 2 identical battle sister commanders from One Page Rules. I'm gonna go for an Iron Man scheme again, red and yellow, but one I've painted a magenta with some white for a neon pink, and the other I found the most pink flesh tone I could in my collection and based her in that, which will make the face easier to paint at the very least. Also, because I was asked about it, I'll go about how I set up my wet palette. Now, I could probably do a whole discussion on wet palettes as I've tried many and I'm very passionate about them, but for this video I just want to talk about what I use and why. The wet palette itself is a scale 75 wet palette that I got when I backed one of their Kickstarters. I was only planning on using it as my backup palette for travel as I had a Redgrass Games one, but it quickly became my go-to. One of the reasons being is that it's far less fiddly to get into. I have a painting desk, and other palettes seem to be designed to travel, but I'm not going anywhere. So being able to just flip open the palette instead of shuffling the lid around just appealed to my painting laziness more. The second reason is it's all one unit, so the wells and the wet palette are in one spot without having to have detachable parts unnecessarily. The third reason was I like the sponge more. Now, no matter what wet palette I use, I want thick sponges as opposed to thin. Since mine dry out fast still, I prefer not to have to refill it so often while painting. The scale 75 sponges are like a fleece which holds the water well and evenly while also holding down the paper. And I also use 2 of them stacked on top of each other. I use filtered water to soak the sponges in, and as far as papers go, I actually just use parchment paper. It did come with papers of its own, but I find most brand of papers that come with wet palettes, so not just the scale 75 here, tend to favor allowing the paint to spread. I guess so you can see your mix better. But for me it just means it's got more surface area and dries even faster. Then I can't reconstitute it once it does, which is exactly what a dry palette feels like. With the parchment paper, the water and the paint beat up on its surface, which in my experience takes longer for the mixes to start to dry. Regardless of that though, things are still going to start to dry, so I have a little bottle I can use to wet it again along the edges. If the paint starts to get a little thick, I find closing the palette and taking a break for about half an hour hydrates the paint again, since the seal creates a little greenhouse for it. If you do want to use some official wet palette papers, I would say go with P3 from Privateer Press. They allow the paint to spread like the other ones, but you can actually rehydrate the paint on it once it's started to dry, so it just has a weird permeability to it that allows you to do that the others don't. Now onto the painting part. Here are the sisters primed side by side, so you can really see the difference between the pinks I'm going for here. Though to start, I'm actually going to be painting the Under Armour a dark gray base coat for now, but I'm getting messy with it, and that's on purpose, because what good is painting on pink if pink is no better than red or yellow at covering black? So I'm channeling my inner messy painter, and we'll come back to clean up these edges immediately. I'm also going to paint a little bit of this figure primed in gray, just so we can see how it goes on over top that as well. For the magenta pink base coat, I had mixed in a bit of white. So when redoing the mix, I only added a little bit, but when I started painting over the black, it really wasn't covering up well. So I mixed in a bit more white and started getting a much better result. It covered up the black pretty well, even though we can still see a bit of the outline of it here. When the red or yellow goes over it, I doubt it'll show through much. For the skin tone pink, this is just my Artist Colors Pink Flesh, which contains a red oxide pigment and a white, nothing else mixed in. When I started fixing up my mistakes with it, it seemed to actually cover pretty well. Far better than I was expecting from my memory of how hard pink is to get over black. I also missed a bit when priming the figure, so here's a little view of how it covers over gray too, which of course is pretty good. But as it started to dry, the black showed through just a little bit more than when the paint was wet. So I think in this case I'd probably have to do another coat just to make sure it doesn't show through for the red. But I'm not going to in this case. And finally, can't forget our little tag along. Painting the gray primer over the black, which also, as you can see, shows through some. So lesson 1 is that black is just hard to paint over. But lesson 2, and I think if you take anything away from this video it should be this, the more saturated a color, the less coverage it has. But mixed with black or white or both will allow it to have a much better coverage. But even then, we'll still probably need a few coats. I finished up the Under Armour with just a wash and a highlight off camera, and now it's time for the main event. This is just my Chimera Color Pure Red pigment. So from our previous lesson about saturated colors, that would mean it has the worst coverage, though the Chimeras have pretty heavy pigment loads, so normally have alright coverage. But as I start to paint over the pink, the legend of this hack becomes truth. The evidence is there before me, though I knew a bit ahead of you guys because as you can see I painted it a bit then forgot to record again. The red goes on smoothly and dried flat, and is quite vibrant. I started to realize that I was just painting red with no shades by the time I got to this arm, so I mixed in some black to do a wet blend and see how that comes out over top the pink. Quite amazingly, you can watch the blend happening smoothly over the pink skin. Though this comes with a bit of a warning. Once you do one pass, you've lost all the power of the pink. So I think for me, putting down the red all over first, then doing the wet blend is going to give the best result. Now, what about over the neon magenta pink? Starting with the camera rolling this time, I capture pretty much the same revelation. The red over the magenta pink also goes on opaque and smooth. Also doing some of the wet blending to capture what it was like, and I'd say it feels almost exactly the same. So I guess it doesn't matter what pink you use. On the red side of things, or magenta, you'll get good coverage. Though we should compare just to make sure. And let's not forget our outlier, with a single coat of red over the white. Side by side, I don't think I'd be able to tell the difference if it wasn't for all the other parts of the pink sticking out. But if we just focused on the red, I'd say they both did a good job. Now what about the other way? I have some yellow to do, but I want to do it over a clean base of pink. So how well do our pinks go over red? The skin pink has a bit of trouble with some of the red poking out after a single layer, but the magenta covers it so well you can barely tell it was red in the first place. So that's a big plus for the magenta if you're an untidy painter. I have 2 yellows added to my palette now, a cool yellow and a warm yellow. These 2 notorious for having the worst coverage. I start on the skin pink and it seems to be covering it very well. It's a bit blotchy still, but it retains its vibrancy. When it came to the red, there wasn't much difference. However, between the yellows, there's a huge difference. As you can see now, the same yellow going over the magenta pink, you have lots of the magenta poking through as red, which means when it comes to this cool yellow at least, the pink skin is the winner here. So what about the warm yellow? Will the results be the same? Unfortunately, in this case, I think they will be. The skin pink allows the warm yellow to stay warm, but keep its vibrancy over the cloak, and it looks pretty even too. But when it comes to the magenta pink, same problem. It converts it to red and too much pokes through the yellow after only one coat. I think the problem here is that magenta is a primary color in that when mixed with yellow, it makes red. So putting yellow over that magenta just turns the underlayer red while the transparency is still there. This is layer number 4 I'm adding to this cloak in this shot. So yeah, unfortunately when it comes to yellow, these pinks are not equal. And what about over a light gray? Well, yellow loves white, and in this case gives you a solid saturated color over it. But that gray layer needs to be solid itself, as the yellow isn't covering anything up. So the question that's begging to be answered, for me at least, is so what? What does red going over pink really well do other than giving a nice even red? You're still going to have to shade and highlight it. But when highlighting red, we have 2 directions to go. Add white for a pinkish color, or add yellow or orange to go for the vibrancy route. But none of those are red. Reds are weird that way, and once you're at max red, you have to shift tone to go higher. So for me, I like to highlight red with maximum red. So if this trick with the pinks works, then we can get our brightest red using the pinks as highlights. That's what I'm doing here. So further along with the model, I gave the red a wash with a dark shade and then layered the red. But to highlight, I'm adding the pinks to the edges, which now I'm going over with the red for maximum red. I'm not being careful to retrace the lines, as my theory is that the underpainting will show through with the brightest possible red. Over the magenta, the effect actually works a little too well. I can see almost every brush stroke left under it, whereas the skin pink still leaves that highlight, but it's a bit more subtle about it. I feel like if I didn't relayer the red first and just did the wash and then highlighted with the pink, then did the red relayering, it would have come out with an even sharper contrast than the red. I went ahead and finished the rest of the sisters, just the hair, face, and metallics, practicing my non-metal metal a bit. I think the color scheme can use a bit of work for sure. It was for science in the end, to find out if there's any truth to this idea that red and yellow go over pink better. And while for the red I'd say I agree, for the yellow, I still think I prefer going over a gray. And while the skin pink worked to keep the yellow vibrant, it was a lot of work to get the pink to blend to have the yellow go over top. So for me, if I'm already doing the work, just do it with the original color you want it to be. Red though, both worked stellarly. And when it comes to highlighting, my usual formula for red was to highlight white and overcoat it. But the pink actually takes that concept and makes it seem much more foolproof. So I'll probably use it from now on. If anyone has questions about the tools I use while painting, be sure to ask in the comments. I'm sure I could go on forever about it. I mean, not every tool works for everyone, but I can tell you what works for me. Thanks for joining me on this adventure, and I'll see you on the next one.